Okay, period 7, looking at 1890 to 1945, is a pretty long review. Even though it's not weighted any more than, say, period 6 or period 8, you're going to get the same amount of questions on the test just about from this period as you are almost any other. For whatever reason, there's a lot more very specific terms and people on the framework. And if it's on the framework, I need to make sure that I go over it with you. So apologies in advance that this one's a bit longer than normal, but bear with me. We will get through it together. All right. Looking at urban reformers in the late 1800s, one term definitely to know is the idea of the social gospel. This was popular among Protestant Christians, and it said that Christians had a moral responsibility to confront social problems like poverty. This is not really a Catholic phenomenon, but it is definitely promoted by Christian ministers, definitely in and around urban areas. Another reform kind of movement in this period is the establishment of various different settlement houses. Settlement houses are like big charities that are trying to provide support for the urban poor, especially immigrants. They're providing basic health care, they're providing basic job training, helping them to learn English, sometimes providing a daycare for children so that women can get a job, and so on. The first in the nation was in Chicago. It was built by Jane Addams and called Hull House. And Hull House is going to serve as a model for other settlement houses across the country. The progressive era in the late 1800s, early 1900s is a pretty substantial shift in the thinking of some Americans about the way the government should operate. Most progressives, generally speaking, wanted to use government action to solve big social problems. These tend to be led by middle-class reformers, especially women, and they reject the kind of traditional Gilded Age notion of social Darwinism, believing that cooperation rather than competition is what's going to improve society. Now, progressive reformers are trying to accomplish a lot of different goals. They are not always on the same page in that respect. These are a lot of reform movements that we just kind of collectively refer to as the progressive movement. But some of the key goals is one, democratization. That means increasing or expanding democracy to include more people and to give people a greater voice in their own government. So we see this through the 17th Amendment to the Constitution that calls or that makes senators elected by a direct election rather than chosen by state legislatures. We see this in the women's suffrage movement, which will finally be completed in the progressive era with the 19th Amendment. But most progressive reforms are happening at the local level. And here we have, again, this push for democratization in different ways. So some states end up passing things like initiative, recall, and referendum. Remember, the initiative is the idea that citizens can put something in front of the legislature, forcing them to make a decision on it. A recall is where citizens vote to remove a public official. And then a referendum is when the legislature can put something on the ballot or like a proposed legislation on the ballot for voters to decide. Also, a big goal of many progressive reformers is simply to tackle the problems created by the Gilded Age and our rapid industrialization. So they're looking to regulate big business by passing child labor laws, antitrust or anti-monopoly legislation, regulations on how products are made, like the Pure Food and Drug Act and the Meat Inspection Act, etc. Some constitutional amendments that come out of the progressive era are first, the 16th Amendment, which allows Congress to collect a graduated income tax, meaning that you are taxed at a higher rate the more money you make. They also passed the 17th Amendment, which allows senators to be elected by a popular vote rather than be chosen by state legislatures as they had been. The 18th is going to pass prohibition, which prohibits the sale, manufacture, or transportation of alcohol. And then the 19th is going to grant women the right to vote across the nation. Some reformers that are helping to propel the progressive movement are so-called muckrakers. Muckrakers are like investigative reporters or authors who try to promote social reform by exposing corruption and urban problems, kind of like they're raking muck so that you can see what's underneath it. These muckrakers are leading critics of urban party bosses and corporate robber barons. And the mass circulation of newspapers and magazines and a growing literacy rate at the turn of the century really helped them to reach a large audience. There are three muckrakers that you should know as examples. One is Upton Sinclair. He wrote The Jungle, which exposes disgusting and corrupt practices in the meat packing industry, and it leads to the passage of the Pure Food and Drug Act, as well as the Meat Inspection Act. Next is Jacob Riis. He publishes a book of photography called How the Other Half Lives that exposes urban poverty conditions. Finally, Ida Tarbell writes a expose on J.D. Rockefeller's Standard Oil Company called The History of the Standard Oil Company. Now, although the progressive movement is primarily a local movement, there are certainly some national effects for this. We definitely saw that with the amendments to the Constitution. But we have three successive progressive presidents. The first is Theodore Roosevelt. He is active in conservation efforts for the environment. He signs into law legislation to end unsanitary meatpacking practices, the Meat Inspection Act. He helped to reform the railroads, eliminate unsafe drug products with the Pure Food and Drug Act, and he was an avid trust buster, breaking up what he called bad monopolies. He was also responsible for changing the government's position on labor disputes. So rather than the government intervening in a strike on the side of big business as they had during the Gilded Age, Roosevelt is going to set the standard that government will step in as a neutral arbitrator to help both sides negotiate a settlement. And he'll pioneer this with the anthracite coal strike in 1902. Now, he'll serve 2 full terms and then will come back after 4 years and run as a third-party candidate for a third term under the Progressive or Bull Moose banner, is a political party that he creates on his own. And in this 1912 election, he will split the vote of Republicans between himself and the Republican candidate, William Howard Taft, which weakens their electoral vote count and allows for a Democrat, Woodrow Wilson, to win. But after Roosevelt serves his first 2 terms, his vice president, William Howard Taft, will become president. He was handpicked by Roosevelt, but for a lot of progressives, he proved to be something of a disappointment. Although in retrospect, he's arguably more progressive than Roosevelt, but he didn't have the kind of big activist personality that his predecessor had. Again, like I say, Roosevelt comes back after 4 years of Taft, and he runs as a progressive candidate for president. He and Taft will split the vote, allowing for a Democratic candidate, Woodrow Wilson, to win. And Wilson ends up being more of a progressive than his campaign might have otherwise indicated. He's a vigorous reformer who addressed high tariffs. He addressed banking problems through like the Federal Reserve, which he supported. And the Federal Reserve Act is going to establish a system of district banks coordinated by a central board. Basically, they're trying to make currency and credit more elastic, meaning that they're trying to kind of help stabilize the banking market to eliminate this sort of boom and bust cycle that the United States has continually gone through in the last few decades. Some female reformers and female reform movements of note. Primarily during the Progressive era, we see the fight for women's suffrage. We see women's suffrage being granted at the state level in some places, primarily Western states. Frontier life tended to promote acceptance of greater equality for women because of the role that they play in establishing new societies. So before 1900, it was only Western states that had granted women's suffrage, going as far back as Wyoming in 1869. But this state-by-state strategy was slow, and more militant reformers like Alice Paul pushed for a national amendment, which they'll get with the 19th Amendment in 1920 that guaranteed women across the nation the right to vote. A couple of other female reformers in the progressive era were of note. One is Ida B. Wells Barnett. She advocated for women's rights, but also opposed lynching, writing all sorts of exposés like A Red Record, Southern Horrors in all its phases, Mob Rule in New Orleans, and other things like that. Also, Margaret Sanger, who was an advocate for birth control and family planning, believing that this is an anti-poverty issue that helped the poor have less children and less mouths to feed, but at the same time, she believed it was a way to gain women's sexual liberation so that they could choose when they became mothers and thus put their career or their education or whatever else on hold, perhaps permanently. But women were actively involved in all sorts of efforts across the progressive spectrum, including child labor laws and limitations on working hours for women and children. Now, in the workplace, at the turn of the century, most female workers were employed outside the home, were young and unmarried. Once they got older and married, then they would typically stop working outside the home. Most of these worked in domestic fields, so cooks, maids, nannies, but also women were employed in the garment industry, sewing things like shirtwaists, for example, in sweatshops in, say, like New York. Women were less likely to be in professional fields like medicine or law, mostly because they were barred from getting education at such schools and universities who would just deny them admission. Some African Americans during the progressive era of note. Certainly, we have Booker T. Washington and W.E.B. Du Bois. These two men are more likely to come up on the exam than any other African American figure in U.S. history. So they're two sides of the same coin. They both have very different visions for African American freedom. Booker T. Washington gives his Atlanta Compromise speech in 1895, which encouraged African Americans to seek economic opportunities rather than political rights. And he urged a sort of gradual approach to equal rights, saying that African Americans had to prove their economic worth before they could expect to attain equality. He discouraged public political agitation for, like civil rights protests for African Americans, because he thought that that would lead to violence that could only end badly for African Americans. And as part of his gradual approach to attaining equal rights, he tacitly accepts separate but equal. He basically believes that African Americans should kind of put up with Jim Crow for the time being until later on when they prove their economic worth and then could agitate for equal rights. Now, on the other hand, you have W.E.B. Du Bois. Du Bois is not a gradualist. He's an advocate for immediate equality, and he does not discourage public political agitation. His argument is that there is nothing to be proved, there is nothing to be earned. Equal rights have already been bestowed by the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment, and they're not fighting to earn anything, they're fighting not to lose it. So he goes on to be a co-founder of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People in 1909, and was an avid critic of Booker T. Washington's gradual approach, as was the NAACP, which he was again founding member of. Now, the NAACP did focus a little less on political agitation, like civil rights marches or boycotts, and more on using the courts to achieve equality by challenging laws as discriminatory and being in violation of the 14th Amendment. And they have a lot of success here, but this is a kind of slow, gradual process over the course of decades. Moving on, looking at American involvement in World War I. So the war breaks out in Europe and has very little to do with the United States, or at least its causes do. The United States, or rather President Wilson, will issue a proclamation of neutrality to try to keep us out of things, but insisted that the United States should still be able to trade with all parties involved if they wanted to. And this is pretty consistent with national policy since George Washington's proclamation of neutrality in his farewell address. However, a German blockade of Britain challenges our neutrality because they are using unrestricted submarine warfare, sinking ships trying to get to Britain. And that included, in some cases, U.S. merchant vessels, and notoriously, a British passenger liner called the Lusitania which, when it was fired upon and sunk, led to the drowning of 128 Americans in the process. This brings tensions between the United States and Germany to a very high point, and the kind of straw that broke the camel's back, as it were, is the so-called Zimmermann Telegram or Zimmermann Note. Here, in an effort to keep the United States out of the war, Germany offers Mexico an alliance in exchange for the territory that they had lost in the Mexican-American War back in the early 1800s. Mexico certainly does not take them up on this offer, but when this this offer goes public, Wilson will then ask for a declaration of war from Congress. Wilson's war message in and of itself is important. He is asking Congress to declare war on Germany and the Central Powers. He accuses the Germans of violating the freedom of the seas, and he turns the war into a kind of idealistic crusade where he calls this war effort one to make the world safe for democracy. So he's going to cast this war not as one of conquest or revenge, but rather one to ensure democratic rights to groups across the world or other nations across the world, and cast Germany as this dictatorship that is an enemy of freedom. And this is a significant shift for the United States. It breaks with our tradition of neutrality that had been set by Washington, and it gets us involved in European affairs, contrary to the Monroe Doctrine from the early 1800s. Some effects of the war at home is first the Great Migration. In 1915, most African Americans lived in the South, and Jim Crow laws subjected them to discrimination and poverty. In World War I, wartime demands for labor in factories in the North and Midwest attracted a lot of African Americans to move there and settle, looking for better lives and better job opportunities. They're going to lead to some race riots during the Red Summer in places like Chicago, St. Louis, Philadelphia, and so on. Next, and very importantly, one of the agencies created by the U.S. government to conduct the war effort is the so-called Committee on Public Information, also known as the Creel Committee. And this is our propaganda agency during the war, and it creates propaganda to try to arouse support for the war, support for enlisting and buying war bonds, and importantly, to stifle dissent or to silence those that disagree or oppose the war effort. Americans will be persuaded to buy war bonds by the CPI, and also are convinced that Germany is a barbarous nation. And Germany is often depicted in a very subhuman manner in a lot of the propaganda, depicted as beasts, monsters, Huns, and so on. Now, abroad, the United States, or rather Woodrow Wilson, tries to have his so-called 14 points included in the peace treaty that ends the war. So his 14 points were kind of a vision for a post-war world where rules could be put in place that would prevent another war like the one we just had. So Wilson's 14 points called for things like open diplomacy, freedom of the seas, self-determination, and most importantly, a League of Nations, which would have been, or which in Wilson's view was a diplomatic institution where all nations would be represented and could come to settle their differences through diplomacy and negotiation rather than resorting to war. Now, none of these, or rather 13 of these points, are effectively ignored by the Paris Peace Conference. What does get entered into the agreement is the League of Nations, but in a much less influential role and a much less powerful role than Wilson had envisioned. It's not very inclusive. It doesn't automatically include all nations across the world, and it doesn't have any enforcement powers. So if a nation violates international law, the League of Nations can do nothing about it. Despite the president's help in writing the 14 points and the inclusion of his League of Nations, the United States never actually signs the Treaty of Versailles, nor does it join the League of Nations. Opponents in the Senate, called irreconcilables, believed that the League of Nations would lead to further involvement in foreign wars. The irreconcilables are led by Henry Cabot Lodge, who's an old political opponent of Wilson's, and because both sides refused to compromise, the treaty is never ratified by the Senate, and thus the United States never signs it, and we never join the League of Nations. At the end of the war, and in its immediate aftermath, the United States goes through a period called the Red Scare. This is driven by a couple of things. First, the communist or Bolshevik revolution in Russia that established the Soviet Union, which is the first communist state in the world. There was fear that radical elements in the United States might launch a similar communist revolution, and that fear is kind of bolstered by widespread post-war labor strikes to try to maintain benefits that workers had received during the war. But a lot of people associated the labor movement with radical political ideology. So we have this fear that the United States has been infiltrated by communists and they are potentially going to overthrow the government. This will result in the Palmer raids. The Palmer raids are caused by this Red Scare fear of communism and radicalism, and they are led by the Attorney General, which is the head of the Justice Department, named A. Mitchell Palmer, and they were conducted against suspected communists, anarchists, the IWW, the American Socialist Party, different labor unions, and so on. And in the process, these raids disregarded basic civil liberties. They didn't use search warrants. They denied people they arrested legal counsel. And in some cases, they actually deported people without any kind of due process, meaning they weren't charged with a crime. There was no trial or anything like that. After World War I, the United States moves into the 1920s, and it is typically characterized as a decade of prosperity. Cities grew, standards of living generally rose, consumer goods like radios and automobiles became more affordable, and stock market investment grew pretty rapidly. That said, many Midwestern and Southern farmers have fallen on hard times in the 1920s, and many consumer goods and even stocks were being purchased widely on credit, and that's very risky, especially if folks can't pay those things back. The 1920s is also kind of a conservative decade, at least politically. The 1920s saw a string of Republican presidents who were more reflective of a more conservative model of republicanism, and they practiced more laissez-faire economic policies. They favored tax cuts for the wealthy, tax cuts for the businesses, believing that that would help the economy to grow, and they also pursue kind of isolationism. Trying to withdraw the United States from global affairs after World War I, kind of that return to normalcy that our first Republican president in the 1920s, Warren G. Harding, had promised in his campaign. A couple examples of this. One, the Washington Naval Conference. This sees the United States sign on to an international treaty that agrees that world powers will limit the size of their navies in an effort to prevent us from using them against one another. Also, the United States signs on to the Kellogg-Briand Pact, which is an agreement between over 60 nations that renounced war as a tool of foreign policy. Ultimately, though, this is not enforceable and therefore meaningless. In the 1920s, we also see this kind of conflict between a conservative traditional vision and a more modernist vision. So in the arts, we see the emergence of the Lost Generation, writers like F. Scott Fitzgerald, Ernest Hemingway, Gertrude Stein. They criticized middle-class materialism and conformity and were generally disillusioned with traditional American values. Also, in the arts, we see the creation of jazz, arguably the first purely unique American musical form. It was created by African-American musicians. It became popular with young Americans because it symbolized a kind of desire to break from tradition. And in the 1930s, jazz will effectively be co-opted by white artists and become very mainstream. Mass entertainment is emerging in the 1920s as well. Movies were a popular form of this. Professional sports like baseball became big business. 9 out of 10 homes by the end of the decade had a radio, and national radio networks and radio shows reached millions of Americans. And what this means is that Americans across the country, millions of people, are all experiencing the same news, the same music, the same culture, and we're kind of tying ourselves together culturally more than we've ever been able to before. We also see something that's characteristic of the 1920s is a increased nativism and increased racism. And these are all kind of responses to modernism. And another response to modernism too, which is not necessarily connected to racism or nativism, is the rise in religious fundamentalists. They stressed a literal interpretation of the Bible. Mostly this was popular among Protestants and what we might consider the Bible Belt today, so like the South and Midwest. The biggest illustration of this conflict between the sort of fundamental way of thinking about religion in the Bible and a more modern view scientifically is the Scopes monkey trial, in which there is a sort of nationally broadcast contest between a defender of fundamentalism, William Jennings Bryan, and a defender of more scientific thought, with Clarence Darrow, as they argued a court case over the teaching of evolution in a Tennessee classroom. Moving on to nativism and racism. So the Ku Klux Klan is going to kind of reemerge in the 1910s and 20s after that organization was glorified by a blockbuster film called The Birth of a Nation, which portrayed the Klan as a kind of heroes, these sort of white knights riding in to rescue poor Southerners from African Americans who are now free of slavery. But the Klan not only favored white supremacy. What makes this Ku Klux Klan different from the one in the Reconstruction era in the 1870s is because they are also anti-immigrant, favoring a lot of immigration restrictions. And this gives them national appeal. And in fact, there were more members of the Klan outside of the South in the 1920s than there were in the South. And this is reflected, or rather this nativism of the era is reflected in the passage of the Emergency Quota Act and the National Origins Act, which used quotas to restrict the flow of immigrants from Southern and Eastern Europe. Also, there's a sensational court case in the era called the Sacco and Vanzetti case, where two immigrants who are also political radicals are scapegoated for a crime they almost certainly didn't commit. They are found guilty and sentenced to execution. During the 1920s, we see some changes in African American culture. We had the emergence of the Harlem Renaissance, which is an explosion of African American creativity and pride in the 1920s, pushed forward by poets like Langston Hughes and authors like Zora Neale Hurston, as well as musicians like Louis Armstrong. But this is a direct result from the Great Migration, which has continued into the 1920s as immigration restrictions go into effect, which means that there's still a high demand for cheap labor, and African Americans are taking those opportunities. Thousands of African Americans will continue to migrate to the North and the Midwest for industrial jobs and to, of course, escape Jim Crow segregation during the so-called Great Migration. While the Harlem Renaissance does express pride in Black identity, so does a new African American leader emerging in the 1910s and 20s, the leader of the Universal Negro Improvement Association named Marcus Garvey. So he expressed pride in Black culture and advocated that African Americans migrate to Africa to create a modern industrialized nationalist African state that would be on par with European nations or the United States and so on. Women in the era experienced some changes, symbolic of a kind of new vision of gender norms as represented by flappers, because a flapper is a woman who is characterized by challenging traditional attitudes, including modes of dress, language, social interaction, and so on. That said, though, the feminist movement really kind of declined in the 1920s, and that's largely because the 19th Amendment, for many women's rights advocates, was seen as kind of mission accomplished, and many women removed themselves from the movement after that, believing their job was done. But those that remained in the movement disagreed over what the movement's next goals should be. And as a result, the women's rights movement really kind of enters a period of time that's called the Doldrums, so a period of non-movement, really until the 1960s. At the end of the 1920s, we have the stock market crash on Black Tuesday. This will end the prosperity, or at least the perceived prosperity of the 1920s, and lead us into the Great Depression during the 1930s. So once the stock market crashes, we have a loss in confidence in the stock market, businesses and banks close, and unemployment rises rapidly to 25%. Now, why did the market crash? Well, companies were overproducing a lot of consumer goods, and so they started to sell these goods on credit to people that were traditionally considered too risky to lend to. So as consumers are increasingly using credit to buy goods, this led to an overvaluing of a company's value in their stock. And we even see stock practices like buying on margin, which allows people to buy stock with very little money down and pay the rest of it off later on. So you have stocks, and companies themselves are greatly overvalued. And when the market corrects for that, you're going to have about $10 billion in market value just sort of evaporate overnight. And that's going to have cascading effects across the rest of the economy, causing businesses to close, banks to close, unemployment to go up. We already know that during the 1920s, farm prosperity was declining, and it had actually fell by 2/3 from 1920 to 1930. So parts of the economy were already suffering before the stock market crash. And one of the only efforts that President Herbert Hoover made to try to alleviate the situation after the stock market crash made things worse. So the Hawley-Smoot tariff passed in 1930 raised taxes on imports, or raised tariffs, but that triggered a decline in international trade because other countries raised their taxes on our imported goods as well, and thus international trade really kind of grinds to a halt, and it makes things worse. Um, Hoover was kind of an inactive president here. And that's because he believed that economic recovery depended primarily on the business community. He preferred this kind of associational action between government and business rather than a kind of direct aid to people who were suffering from the Depression. So he urged Americans to rely on the tradition of rugged individualism, taking care of yourself, and the ideas of laissez-faire, that the economy will eventually correct itself. That said, at the end of his term in 1932, he is going to establish the Reconstruction Finance Corporation to loan government money to banks and businesses, and hopefully to jumpstart the economy that way. Perceived as being too little too late, and also misdirected because it goes to the wealthy rather than the poor. And he loses the next election and doesn't get elected to a second term, and instead we'll get Franklin Delano Roosevelt, a Democrat, going to usher in the New Deal. Something that didn't help Hoover in his reelection bid was how he treated the Bonus Expeditionary Force, the Bonus Army. So in 1932, about 20,000 World War I veterans marched on Washington, D.C. to demand a promised enlistment bonus early. Hoover's going to authorize military force to violently evict them, and it'll actually kill a couple of people. And it's a public relations nightmare. It portrayed Hoover as callous and out of touch, and it definitely bolstered his opponent, Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Roosevelt, who's elected in 1932, favors direct relief to individuals. He favored a very activist federal government to get involved in the economy to try to alleviate the plight of the Great Depression. He was trying to restructure U.S. capitalism rather than replace it with socialism, as we were seeing happening in some other countries at the time in response to the Depression. He and his administration are going to adopt Keynesian economic theory, which uses deficit spending, or the government spending a lot of money, even spending themselves into debt, on public works programs that are meant to help people and get a paycheck to be able to pay their debts, to pay a mortgage, and so on. And in doing so, kind of jumpstart the economy again. So in the first 100 days of Roosevelt's administration, he's trying to address restoring confidence in the banking system, which we'll do through a bank holiday and the FDIC. He wants to try to create new jobs in the public sector, in other words, new government jobs. We'll see that through things like the Civilian Conservation Corps and the Tennessee Valley Authority. And he's going to try to raise farm prices by restricting production through the AAA, or Agricultural Adjustment Administration, which will pay farmers to destroy crops. So here we go. So the goal of the AAA is to raise farm prices by limiting production. So it'll establish a system of crop controls and pay farmers to limit their production by plowing over perfectly good crops or slaughtering livestock and not sending it to market and so on. And it got a lot of criticism because it was considered to be a waste of food in a time of poverty and starvation. Another New Deal agency to know is the National Industrial, or another law to know, I guess, is the National Industrial Recovery Act. The NRA is going to allow businesses to kind of regulate themselves through fair codes of competition, but these are decided upon in partnership with the government and unions. And by giving unions a place at the table, it helps to protect them and their existence and their activities. Next, the Civilian Conservation Corps. This is one of those works projects. It's going to employ young men in rural works projects, oftentimes environmental works projects, thus helping to drive down unemployment. In the second New Deal, FDR is going to have passed the Social Security Act. And this creates a federal pension system funded by an employer-matched tax on wages. That means that you're putting in money a little bit every paycheck during your working life. And when you get to retirement, you can then pull out of that fund to help support you in your old age, in your retirement, when you are unlikely to be able to work anymore. Also, we have the Wagner Act, which is really called the National Labor Relations Act and is also known as the Magna Carta of Labor. This really creates government support of unions and the labor movement by ensuring workers' rights to organize and to bargain collectively. And it is, along with the NRA, is really going to lead to a dramatic increase in union membership during this period. The New Deal affected African Americans and results in a pretty pretty substantial political shift for them. So the New Deal helped African Americans survive some of the worst hardships of the Great Depression, although it didn't directly confront segregation. And the perception that New Deal policies are more beneficial than Republican policies leads African Americans as a voter bloc to abandon the Republican Party and begin supporting the Democratic Party in large numbers. And they're going to be part of this New Deal coalition of different voters, which is going to give Democrats the upper hand in elections nationally for the foreseeable future. Something that actually hurts FDR's popularity is his so-called court packing scheme. After the Supreme Court declared key parts of the New Deal unconstitutional, he tries to get a law passed that would add more justices to the Supreme Court that would be supportive of his New Deal programs. This was widely criticized, it never passed, and it helps to lose FDR some support. Now, the impact of the New Deal overall. It definitely marked a new direction for the federal government. It's the end of laissez-faire. It's the end of government policies of rugged individualism, and instead, it now accepts that the government should work to enhance social welfare and economic security, and in fact, it expects that that's what government is supposed to do. So this is a very radical shift in American thinking about what the purpose of our government actually is. Now, it's partially successful in reducing unemployment and helping to revive the economy. Things at the end of the New Deal are certainly better than they were at the very beginning, but it doesn't end the Great Depression. The Great Depression will not end until the massive military spending and manufacturing in World War II after we get involved. Now, another political effect of the New Deal is it's going to lead to the emergence of the Democrats as the majority party. Again, this New Deal coalition of various different groups, including African Americans, is going to give them a majority moving forward politically really until the end of the 1960s. Some other effects of the New Deal is this dramatic expansion of union membership during the 1930s. So we have the emergence of a new union called the Congress of Industrial Organizations, and they work to organize unskilled factory workers in basic manufacturing industry like steel and automobiles. They also pioneered the use of a new method of striking called the sit-down strike, where they would refuse to work but then not vacate the factory floor so that management couldn't bring in scabs to replace them. Now, the CIO had originally been part of the AFL, but the AFL did not want to organize unskilled and semi-skilled workers and wanted to stick with organizing skilled workers in craft fields. And this leads to a split at their 1935 convention. The CIO and AFL will recombine later on in the 1950s to become the AFL-CIO, but for the time being, the AFL will continue to be a labor union that's focused really just on skilled laborers and craft fields and bread and butter issues, whereas the CIO is organizing entire industries regardless of the skill level of their workers. And the New Deal coalition is an important political takeaway. It included white Southerners, African Americans, ethnic minorities, union members, and urban industrial laborers. And it's this large shift in African American voters from the Republican Party to the Democratic Party that is going to help promote Democratic dominance for a few decades. And although the New Deal was popular and had majority support, it was criticized sometimes as not going far enough, including criticism from populists like Huey P. Long, also Upton Sinclair, Father Charles Coughlin, and so on. American society during the New Deal. During the Great Depression, we had the emergence of so-called Hoovervilles. Millions of people were evicted from their homes when they couldn't pay their mortgages, and many built these sort of hastily constructed shanty towns out of scrap wood and scrap metal in public places in most U.S. cities. So here's a photograph of a Hooverville in New York City, actually in Central Park. Um, so while some are losing their homes, others are certainly losing their jobs, and they have to go on the move in order to try to find gainful employment. So the Great Depression led to a mass migration of Americans across the country looking for work. We also see a kind of continuation of the Great Migration, albeit in smaller numbers, of African Americans to northern and midwestern cities. Finally, looking at American involvement in World War II. So again, like World War I, the war had really already started prior to our involvement, and the United States positions itself again as trying to remain neutral. So we have something called the Stimson Doctrine in 1932, which declared that the United States wouldn't recognize territorial acquisitions that were achieved by force. This was mostly aimed at refusing to recognize territory conquered by the Japanese in the Pacific. Uh, Congress had also passed the Neutrality Acts. These are a series of laws that expressed our commitment to isolationism and drew on the traditional notions put down originally in Washington's farewell address and tried to keep us out of the war by not supplying and not working with belligerents. That said, as the threat of war grows, FDR finds ways to work around these laws to give aid to countries that are fighting against the Japanese or the Germans. An important one is the Lend-Lease program, where FDR authorized the sale of surplus military equipment to the Allies, even though we officially remained neutral. The full cost of it had to be paid back after the war, and oftentimes those were paid back in the form of military bases. This is primarily used to help Great Britain and to a lesser extent the Soviets to help them resist the expansion of Nazi Germany. The U.S. will finally be brought into the war by the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor. Japan had been dependent on U.S. oil, gasoline, steel, and scrap metal, and when FDR imposed an embargo on these exports in 1940 and 1941, the Japanese essentially considered this tantamount to a declaration of war. Diplomatic negotiations with the United States had reached a stalemate, and the Japanese determined to hobble our Pacific fleet before it can be used against them, and they attack the Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor in Hawaii. After we declare war on the Axis powers, which includes Japan, Germany, and Italy, we will focus on a Germany first strategy. The idea was that we could free up Great Britain and the Soviet Union for a full-scale Allied attack on Japan. We didn't think these two allies could help us against Japan until they had defeated the enemy on their doorstep. So we would defeat Germany first, and then we could all concentrate on Japan. Nonetheless, the United States will be fighting Japan while also fighting in Europe in the coming years. Before our entrance into the war, we have, again, some measures to try to prevent the expansion of fascism. So there's the good neighbor policy, which is an FDR foreign policy toward Latin America, where the U.S. renounced the right to intervene in Latin American political affairs and sought greater economic cooperation with reciprocal trade agreements. And all of this was designed to create a common sort of hemispheric front against the expansion of fascism. Also overseas in the Pacific, the Philippine Islands, an American territory since the Spanish-American War, is conquered by the Japanese in 1942 at the same time that Pearl Harbor is attacked. This will remain under Japanese control until liberated by the United States in the coming years. And after that, because FDR is pursuing or really the Allies generally are supposed to be pursuing a war of liberation, not conquest, the Philippines are granted independence from the United States after the war is over with. The big three, or the so-called big three, are the leaders of the big three allied nations. Franklin Roosevelt being the leader of the United States, Winston Churchill, the prime minister of Britain, and Joseph Stalin, the premier of the Soviet Union. They met at a series of conferences in which they vowed cooperation, demanded the unconditional surrender of the Axis. But the big important conference to know is the conference in Yalta in 1945. This is important because here, the leader of the Soviet Union, Joseph Stalin, promised free elections for Eastern European nations that they had effectively occupied on their push toward Germany. He also vows to help the United States defeat Japan once the war with Germany is over with, but he basically breaks both of these promises later on. The more consequential of these broken promises, though, will be the failure to hold free elections in Eastern Europe, and instead the Soviets are going to set up these kind of communist puppet states in Eastern Europe and effectively divide the continent for the next, 50 years. Back home, the United States has to mobilize our economy and our people to wage the war. But like I've said before, the war is good economically because it helps us to revive the economy, and it virtually ends unemployment, bringing us really near to full employment because of wartime manufacturing. And this is what finally enabled us to emerge from the Great Depression. There are also efforts during the war to prevent the kind of rapid inflation we saw during World War I. So the government, through the Office of Price Administration, instituted these direct price controls to try to halt inflation. And it also established a kind of nationwide rationing system for basic things like coffee, gasoline, and other consumer goods. The war affected minority groups in important ways. So African Americans continued their migration to urban centers in the North and the West. FDR issues an executive order during the war to forbid racial discrimination in defense industries. And women certainly entered the workplace in much larger numbers than before in order to take jobs vacated by men going overseas to fight. And Rosie the Riveter becomes this cultural icon for female industrial workers during the Second World War. Perhaps one of the worst civil rights abuses in our history also occurs during World War II, and that's the internment of Japanese-Americans. So FDR will issue an executive order, 9066, which orders all Japanese Americans on the West Coast to be removed to relocation centers for the duration of the war. And this is about 87% of the Japanese American population. It's over 100,000 people. Japanese Americans were sent to internment camps on the grounds that they were a potential security threat, and this was based not in fact, but rather in racial prejudice at the time. Now, this internment was challenged in a court case called Korematsu v. U.S. However, the Supreme Court actually upheld the constitutionality of these internment camps as a wartime necessity. And so this is yet another example of how we typically see in the United States a restriction of civil liberties and civil rights during a time of war or perceived crisis.